The 1960s were a golden era for American cars. Or were they? While some rides became icons, others crashed and burned in spectacular fashion. From design disasters to engineering nightmares, these are the 10 worst American cars of the 1960s. Buckle up for a journey through the decade's biggest automotive blunders. 1960 Chrysler Valiant. Let's talk about the 1960 Chrysler Valiant, which, ironically, was anything but valiant. Chrysler's attempt at building a compact car to compete with the likes of the Ford Falcon and Chevy Corvair ended up being a disaster so comically bad, it deserves its place in the Hall of Shame for worst American cars of the 1960s. First, the good news. It had a slant-six engine. That was about it. Chrysler tried to sell this little economy car as a solid, no-nonsense family vehicle, but what they delivered was something far less impressive. The Valiant's engine was underwhelming, sluggish, and as responsive as a sloth on a lazy day. Even worse, the car was a mechanical mess with horrendous reliability. Frequent breakdowns were so common that Valiant became a bit of an inside joke amongst car enthusiasts. Valiant only if you considered constantly fixing it to be a valiant effort. The Valiant's handling? Don't even bother asking. It was as stiff as an old board, with a ride that felt like driving a wheelbarrow over a gravel road. Despite Chrysler's hopes of winning over small car buyers, the Valiant simply couldn't compete with its competition in any meaningful way. Chrysler eventually phased out the Valiant in favor of better designed models, but not before it became a symbol of what happens when an automaker doesn't quite hit the mark. With fewer than 70,000 units sold in the US that year, the Valiant's reputation was just as underwhelming as its performance. A noble attempt, but like trying to sprint in quicksand. Eventually, it just wasn't going to happen. 1960 Chevrolet Corvair. Alright, the 1960 Chevrolet Corvair was GM's attempt to bring European flair to the American market. It was sleek, it was affordable, and it was different. Just not in the way anyone hoped. Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed famously skewered the Corvair, but the book barely scratched the surface of this rolling death trap's issues. The Corvair's rear-mounted, air-cooled engine was revolutionary for a domestic car, but it came with a sinister flaw: the rear suspension. Early models lacked a stabilizer bar, which meant the rear wheels had a nasty habit of tucking under during sharp turns. Combine that with oversteer so aggressive it could spin you into the next zip code, and you had a car that drove like a soap bar on a wet floor. Then there were the build quality issues. The engine was prone to overheating, which often led to spectacular blowouts. Drivers reported oil leaks so bad that their garages looked like crime scenes. Some even said the car smoked like a factory chimney after just a few thousand miles. Chevy did eventually address the handling problems, but by the mid-60s, the damage was done. The Corvair was forever linked to the phrase unsafe, and buyers fled to competitors. So, here's the kicker. Later models were actually decent, but they couldn't shake the bad press. 1965 AMC Rambler Marlin. Picture this. 1965 AMC Rambler Marlin, that was known for being the quirky underdog of the American car market, decided to get sporty in 1965. So, what was the result? The Rambler Marlin, a fastback coupe that looked like a salmon swimming upstream. The problem wasn't just that it was ugly, it was that it didn't know what it wanted to be. The Marlin was marketed as a personal luxury car, but it had all the luxury of a discount motel room. The interior was a sea of cheap plastics and vinyl upholstery that screamed, "We ran out of budget." Its design, with that bulbous rear end, made it look like someone stretched a sedan in Photoshop. And let's not forget the engine lineup, which ranged from meh to is it even running? To make matters worse, the Marlin weighed over 3,000 pounds, which made its underpowered engines work harder than a hamster in a wheel. AMC enthusiasts tried to defend it, calling it unique, but even they couldn't explain why the Marlin sales numbers sank faster than the Titanic. Despite AMC's best efforts to push the Marlin, buyers just weren't biting. The car flopped so hard that AMC ditched it after just 3 years, and today, it lives on as a quirky footnote in automotive history. 1962 Dodge Polara 500. The next on the list is the 1962 Dodge Polara 500, which was a car that promised performance and style, but what it delivered was a masterclass in mechanical betrayal. Its push-button transmission was supposed to be cutting-edge technology, but in reality, it was a headache waiting to happen. Imagine this. You're cruising down the road and you need to park. You push the park button, only for the car to ignore you completely and slide into reverse instead. Or worse, the button jams, leaving you stuck in neutral while angry drivers honk behind you. Add in the Polero's abysmal fuel economy, and you had a car that was as thirsty as it was unreliable. Then there was the rust. Oh, the rust. The Polero was so prone to corrosion that owners joked it came with a complimentary tetanus shot. The undercarriage would dissolve at the mere hint of moisture, making it a nightmare for anyone living outside of the desert. Despite these issues, the Polero was marked as a stylish cruiser for the modern driver. If by modern, Dodge meant constantly frustrated and late to work, then they nailed it. 1963 Studebaker Wagoner. So, the 1963 Studebaker Wagoner had one major selling point: its sliding roof. In theory, this feature was genius. A family wagon that could double as a cargo holder capable of carrying tall items like refrigerators. In practice, it was like owning a station wagon with a built-in waterfall every time it rained. The sliding roof panel didn't just leak, it gushed. Owners reported that even light rainstorms turned the car's interior into a soggy mess. And don't even think about taking it through a car wash unless you wanted to explain to your kids why the seats were suddenly swimming pools. The rest of the car wasn't much better. The boxy, utilitarian design looked outdated even by the standards of the 1960s. And while the Wagoner offered plenty of cargo space, its underpowered engines made hauling anything heavier than groceries feel like a Herculean task. Let's not even get started on the rattling roof mechanism, which often jammed and required costly repairs. Studebaker tried to fix these issues, but it was too little, too late. By 1966, the company went out of business and the Wagoner became a symbol of their desperate final years. Today, it's remembered more for its flaws than its innovations. A tragic case of good idea, bad execution. 1964 Plymouth Barracuda. The 1964 Plymouth Barracuda is often overshadowed by the Mustang, which debuted just 2 weeks later. Plymouth hoped to kickstart the pony car craze, but instead, the Barracuda came off like the awkward older sibling who tried too hard to be cool. Let's start with the giant bubble rear window, a single piece of curved glass that covered the entire back of the car. Sure, it was unique, but it also turned the interior into a greenhouse on sunny days. Drivers joked that the only thing hotter than their Barracuda's engine was the sweat dripping off their foreheads. Speaking of the engine, the base slant 6 had the personality of a wet noodle. Even the optional V8 wasn't enough to turn this car into a Mustang killer. The Barracuda's performance was passable, but its uninspired design and lack of pizzazz left it trailing far behind Ford's runaway hit. Despite its shortcomings, the Barracuda paved the way for future iterations that eventually became muscle car icons. But the 1964 model? Let's just say it floundered before it ever had a chance to swim. 1966 Mercury Comet Cyclone GT. The 1966 Mercury Comet Cyclone GT was Mercury's attempt to cash in on the muscle car craze. It had bold stripes, a powerful V8 engine, and a name that screamed speed. Too bad the car couldn't deliver on any of its promises. The Cyclone GT's 390 cubic inch engine looked impressive on paper, but it overheated so often that owners joked it came with a built-in sauna. Head gasket failures were common, as were warped manifolds and occasionally full-blown engine fires. Nothing says high performance like pulling over to watch your car turn into a campfire. The suspension was another sore spot. Mercury claimed the Cyclone GT had a sporty ride, but the reality was more like a roller coaster, unpredictable and slightly nauseating. Hit a pothole at speed, and you'd find yourself bouncing down the road like a basketball. Despite its flashy appearance, the Cyclone GT's mechanical issues made it a nightmare to own. It promised muscle car thrills, but delivered little more than frustration and repair bills. 1963 Buick Skylark Special. So, the 1963 Buick Skylark Special was a car that somehow managed to combine all the wrong features of its bigger, more powerful cousins, leaving buyers wondering what they had gotten themselves into. First, let's talk about the engine. The Skylark Special came with a 215 cubic inch V8, which was fine, except it was woefully underpowered for a car that looked like it should be cruising at 100 miles per hour down the highway. It wasn't the worst engine in the world, but let's just say the Skylark wasn't exactly going to leave any muscle cars quaking in their boots. With just around 155 horsepower in its base configuration, the Skylark's performance was about as exciting as watching paint dry. The car also had handling that could only be described as dull. With its soft suspension and poor steering feel, it wasn't exactly the best for spirited driving, even though its sleek look suggested otherwise. By the time it was done, Buick had managed to create a car that looked sporty but felt like a cushy cruiser that just didn't want to try. Buick's attempt at a sporty compact didn't sell well either. Despite being priced competitively in the small car market, the Skylark Special didn't impress and went on to be remembered mostly as a flop, with just over 100,000 units sold. At the end of the day, it was a car with a lot of style but not much substance, a true lesson in how not to combine luxury with performance. 1960 Ford Falcon Ranchero. The 1960 Ford Falcon Ranchero was part car, part truck, and completely confused about its identity. Based on the compact Ford Falcon, it was too small to function as a proper pickup and too utilitarian to be a comfortable car. The result? A vehicle that didn't excel at anything. The Ranchero's tiny inline-six engine meant that hauling even modest loads was a struggle. Forget about towing anything. The Ranchero was barely capable of carrying a full load of firewood without groaning in protest. And its suspension? Let's just say it made every bump in the road feel like a tectonic event. Design-wise, the Ranchero wasn't winning any beauty contests either. Its odd proportions made it look like a sedan that got lost on its way to a monster truck rally. Buyers were left scratching their heads, wondering who this vehicle was actually for. Despite its flaws, the Ranchero has a quirky charm today. But in its heyday, it was more of what were they thinking than gotta have it. 1961 Chrysler Imperial Crown. The 1961 Chrysler Imperial Crown was supposed to be a luxury car for the elite, but it turned out to be a nightmare to drive. At nearly 19 feet long, it was less a car and more a land yacht that handled like a beached whale. The real horror came from its steering system. Chrysler's fancy electro-hydraulic steering was so unreliable that it often failed mid-turn, leaving drivers wrestling the wheel like contestants in a strongman competition. Parallel parking this beast required the strength of Hercules and the patience of a saint. And let's not forget those over-the-top tail fins. By 1961, tail fins were on their way out, but Chrysler went all in, making the Imperial Crown look like a relic from the 1950s. Pair that with its dismal fuel economy, and you had a car that was impractical, outdated, and absurdly expensive to run. Today, the Imperial Crown is a collectible for those who appreciate its kitschy charm, but back in the 60s, it was more likely to inspire groans than gasps of admiration.